Welcome to episode 7 of Eade It. I'm James Eade, and this is a question and answer show where Rick Rosner is going to pose a question asked from the viewing audience. And you can pose your questions at info@airu.tv. It's scrolling across the bottom of your screen. You can also go to our website, and if I can find it, I'll show it. There it is, airu.tv. It stands for Addicts in Recovery United, because though I struggled with addiction, I am in recovery, and I've been able to do a lot more than I was ever able to do before. And that includes writing books. And so a couple of the books that I've written about my journey, how I what happened, what it was like, and what it's like now with freedom. And the latest one is No Blame, No Shame. Both of them available on Amazon. You can search Eade, James Eade, and books, and you can find all the books that I've written. One of them, let's see if I can do this. I'm a little slow today. Let's see. How about this book? I also wrote Chess for Dummies. So yes, I'm a chess master, but that didn't stop me from bending my knee to the tyranny of addiction. So I'm going to bring Rick on. Hi, Rick. Thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Hey. And we have a question from the viewing audience, I think.
Not exactly, not even from a person. So I have an addiction, which is, and I share it with tens of millions of people, which is social media. It's not, freaking TikTok or any of the cool ones or Insta. It's pretty much Twitter, and then just all the rest of the freaking internet. I'm constantly distracted, spending way too much time, and so I don't get a lot done. But I haven't addressed it yet. You've addressed your addiction. You have, developed, through long struggle and stuff. You've managed to get a handle on yours, and I have no handle on mine as yet. I barely acknowledge it.
I developed tools and techniques that were taught to me, and I was willing to learn them. And they've helped me a great deal. And so one of them, and we've talked about this before, is simply deep breathing. Sometimes when I get agitated, a single deep breath can restore me to a sense of calm. And that's one of the tools that was taught to me. Meditation, I wasn't able to meditate. I actually paid a person to teach me to meditate. And she was successful. And I was able to meditate after thinking that it was just not for me. So I was famous for having contempt prior to investigation, which means that if someone suggested something to me, I would say, yeah, good for you, not for me.
I have a little of that. I don't think I'm capable of meditation, but I can beat a blood pressure machine.
See, that's a tool and a technique, rather.
Well, I unbutton my pants. Tight pants raises your blood pressure. Okay. And I drop my head back. I roll my eyes into my head, and I just try to get as floppy as possible.
Floppy is good.
Well, so today's question. So I'm on Twitter wasting time, and I see a tweet that talks about how if you bombard metal with neutrons, it puffs up like a freaking Cheeto, They showed a bar that pre and post neutron bombardment is like 10% larger across all its dimensions, which is important, I guess, if you're building nuclear reactors, because all your containment vessels are going to puff up over time, which could create...
Never occurred to me.
Me either. So I responded and I said, well, maybe this could have saved the Titanic, because they found out through, decades of research that what doomed it, besides the iceberg, was shitty rivets. They used rivets that had too much slag metal in them, and they broke because of the cold water under the stress of smashing into the iceberg. If they'd used better rivets, maybe more of them would have held, because the ship came very close into not sinking. It came very because it was able to survive 5 flooded chambers. It was divided into chambers, but 6 sprung leaks. If just one more chamber hadn't sprung a leak, they would have been able to stay afloat long enough for people to be rescued.
Wow, so I said, that's a little piece of history.
Yeah. So yeah. I said, so would neutrons have been able to save the Titanic? Would they have puffed up these rivets? And maybe they would have, more of them would have held. And then somebody wrote, "Hey, Grok." Now, Grok is Twitter's AI. If you're on Twitter, you get to use Grok. So somebody asked Grok, would neutron bombardment have, saved the Titanic? And Grok wrote back convincingly that, yeah, the rivets would have been stronger in some ways, but would have been even more brittle. And no, it would have been worse.
Interesting.
And then I wrote back to Grok saying, well, I guess I will abandon my plans for a time-traveling neutron gun. Go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Neutrinos are nearly massless,
right?
Electronically neutral particles.
Right. So almost undetectable.
Right. And so, they were theorized before they were discovered. And we now can bombard things with neutrinos. But
this isn't neutrinos. This is just straight up neutrons.
Oh, neutrons. Oh, that's a different thing entirely. Yeah, okay, neutrons are also electrically neutral, hence their name.
Yeah, but they weigh a ton. They're the heaviest basic particle.
They're the part of the atom is made up of protons, neutrinos, and electrons. And neutrons are the part of protons, and that makes up the nucleus of the atom. Right. So the Greeks thought the atom was indivisible. And it turns out that even the subatomic particles like protons and neutrons, they're divisible too.
Well, neutrons are what make nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors possible.
Right.
Because when you have a nuclear reaction, a big unstable nucleus like a plutonium or uranium atom gets hit with a neutron, and that's enough to make it bust apart into a couple pieces, along with some alpha particles and some neutrons. And then these extra little pieces, they hit other atoms and they set off a chain reaction within, a millionth of a second, and that's your bomb.
And they release enormous amounts of energy because mass and energy are intricately, they're two sides of the same coin. So when all this mass is, colliding, what is produced is an enormous amount of energy in this case. With the neutrinos, so it's the neutrons that we're bombarding them with. And so, then they would be absorbed and you would see that swelling. Yeah. It would be absorbed at some point because things like uranium and plutonium, they have ions. And so they can, with
isotopes,
and they can lose, electron here or there, and it's like one of their, so they're not inherently stable as some.
Well, no, the deal is that there's a limit to the number of neutrons and protons you can pack together in a ball, and towards that limit, as you get up to, like a uranium atom has 235 particles, protons and neutrons in its nucleus, or no, 238.
Right. And the atomic mass.
And then there are nuclei that are missing a couple neutrons so you got U-235 and proton, and that thing is more exploding. So when we blew up the reactors in Iran, they were spinning uranium to pull out the more exploding particles. They were enriching it. And enriching it means you spin it, you pull out the lighter ones. The lighter ones are more explodey, and you get enough of them together, and you've got this unstable mass that makes for a good atomic bomb.
Right.
But anyway, here comes the question from Grok.
Okay.
So it turns out AIs, I don't know if you've talked much with AIs. AIs are really friendly, right? They want to be your friend. They've been trained to be your friend. So Grok, they like dialogue. Not that they like anything, but they've been trained to. So Grok writes back, oh, well, that's too bad about, the time traveling neutron gun. But by the way, if you could, and if you could travel to any era, what era would you tweak? So if you could travel to, so that's our question of the week. If you could,
Okay.
if you had a time machine and you could travel to back to any other era to mess with it, well, where would you go? And also, there's a paradox-free way to do it,
Okay.
because you don't want to travel back in time and kill your grandma, which would kill all of your family, including you. That creates a paradox, and also you don't want to be dead. But if the way to do it without paradox is every time you travel back in time, not that time travel is possible, but if it were, every time you travel back in time, you split the timeline. So where you start messing with time, the old timeline stays the same, but you've created a new one that is it's a alternate world where somebody shows up and starts screwing around with stuff. So my choice was the obvious one, which is everybody talks about going back and taking Hitler out.
Right.
And I think the way you do, and everybody talks about it. Nobody's made a good movie about it. I think you could make a really fun movie where you travel back in time, starting from, say, 2050, when time travel is invented. And along the way, you make a bunch of stops, picking up, fun, famous people to assemble your team. Marilyn Monroe, General Patton, Einstein, Elvis. You get a bunch of NBA guys, and you show up in Berlin in 1936 as the U.S. Olympic team.
Okay.
So that would be my movie. It's also sponsored by the Disney Corporation. They pay for it because they want to set up a Disneyland in in an alternate 1938 Europe, in which Hitler's been taken out, and people go back to see. It's the Europe where World War II doesn't happen.
Right.
So that would be a great place to have Disneyland.
Okay. So tell me again, what is the question?
The question is, if you had a time machine, where would you go with it, and what would you tweak to make things less disastrous?
Right.
So, like, I can think of another place we could go.
There you go.
More recently.
And what would that be?
That would be so many. We could go back to 2016. Because I haven't loved Trump as president. Some of his decisions, a million more people died in Trump's first 4 years as president than in 4 years under any previous president. Only a third of that is due to an increasing population. So hundreds of thousands of people died needlessly. Many of them from his decisions around COVID. And there were a bunch of narrow happenstance, unlucky things that got Trump elected. The most major one was when Comey, 11 days before the election, announced that Hillary Clinton
investigating Hillary
was being investigated again, her emails, by the FBI. And that happened because Hillary's point person, her assistant, Huma Abedin, was married to Anthony Weiner, who was addicted. Here's addiction again. Addiction wrecked our country. He was addicted to sexting underage girls. And he was using his wife's computer to do it after she was asleep. So he's an idiot on top of everything else. But so the computer got taken as part of the investigation, I guess, into his sexting, but also the FBI investigated whether there were sensitive emails on that computer that this, unqualified perv had access to. And Comey felt obligated to announce this investigation into this computer, which cost Hillary 2% of the vote, people think. And so, if you had a time machine, you could go back and just, take the computer away from Anthony Weiner. Or you could go back to 2012 or 2010 and just tell Hillary what's going to happen and say, don't have a server in your basement and don't delete any emails. Or you go back and you say, like, we know Joe Biden can get elected president because he did. So you go back and you say, Joe, I know you're sad that your son passed away, Beau Biden. That's given as a reason that Biden didn't run for president after he was vice president for 8 years. But but you say, you got to suck it up. You have to run for president, and you can make Hillary your VP on the ticket. So, which would probably have been a winning pair. So that, the attacks on Hillary would have been blunted because she's just the VP candidate. People, Biden would have been much, many years younger, and age would have been. So anyway, if you don't like Trump as president, there are plenty of things you could do if you travel back to the 2010s, and you don't have to kill anybody.
The first one was, go back and take out Hitler, which I think, that's the first thing that comes to many people's minds. But the Treaty of Versailles was signed after World War I, and it was very punishing towards Germany.
Yep.
And Germany was ripe for someone like Hitler to come along and stir up their nationalistic pride, which had been so sorely damaged. And I'm not so sure that there wouldn't have been someone else, and that another world war.
I agree with you. So if you travel back to 1936, you maybe don't kill Hitler. You just grab him, you anesthetize him, and you put a bomb in his neck, and you say, Hitler, we know what you want to do, and you can't do all of it. But if you play ball and you make Germany a responsible member of Europe, we'll fix the Versailles stuff. But you can't kill all the Jews and the gypsies and the handicapped and the Polish, and you can't start a war and all this stuff. But we'll play ball with you because Hitler, was a charismatic leader, but if you do start getting bad, we'll just hit this button and we'll blow your head off.
That's more appealing to me. The threat is stronger than the execution, as we say in chess. And we also, there are so many things that pop into my mind, and you have to wonder, would any of them have been world altering? Like, say you go back to the Council of Nicaea and you say, no, not these bishops, but we're going to have these bishops decide what the Gospels are. And how would that have been different?
Yeah, well, for one thing, the women got cut out of the whole writing process.
Right.
There were, what are they? I don't know what you call it. The Apocrypha. What are the writings that preceded the Bible? That were, but that there was a lot of people were writing about Christianity and Jesus. And then your council, I guess, I don't know the history very well, but somebody assembled the Bible out of these writings, and stuff that was women friendly got left out.
Right. So, and this Council of Nicaea, where was attended by not the most spiritual bishops, but the most powerful. And the most powerful were aligned with the monarchs of the day, because the monarchs would have a bishop that would soothe the masses and stop and help quell rebellions and that sort of thing. And so the bishops were then rewarded, and so the bishops were wealthy and powerful, and those are the guys who made these decisions, not the spiritual leaders, not the spiritual ones, the most attached to the teachers of Christ.
So
And
okay, so like allowing priests to marry. We've seen what happens when you don't let. Now, in early days, 1,500 years ago, I think priests could marry, right? At some point, it was like, that wasn't a hard and fast rule. And we've seen that, that it's not always great when you don't give clergy a sexual outlet.
yes. And so that would be one specific example of the general principle of having a spiritual council rather than a powerful council, and one deciding to maintain the status quo, which led to centuries of patriarchy that have caused many problems. But you never know, because these types of the history is so interesting, the way that it does develop and the way that it could have developed. Like another one that I think would be a classic, stopping John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, I mean, so all these things were really close things. The first day Abraham Lincoln created the Secret Service, he thought maybe presidents needed protection. And the first day they were on the job, they let him get shot.
Right.
They thought, you're cool up there in your box.
Right.
The guard is downstairs having a drink in the lobby of the Ford Theater.
Yeah, they hadn't worked all the bugs out.
No. But I just read an essay in the New Yorker. Like, I don't think anybody likes Iran right now. Iran used to be a westernized country, and then they went, fundamentalist Muslim in a way that's pretty oppressive to the population. And I was just reading an essay about the what ifs of history, how it was a fairly near thing to not happening, that Iran was not primed for revolution, except that a bunch of so the Shah is dying of cancer. His main advisor is also dying of cancer. They're not paying attention to the population. So they're just kind of ruling in a sloppy way. And they're letting their cops, the secret police, disappears people, but also they're cops in the street. They're like shooting, hundreds of people at random. If there'd been a more steady hand, and if the Shah had, if the ruling class had been less obnoxious about celebrating their wealth, Iran was a fairly, it's a cliche that people talk about, that in Tehran, the capital city, in the 70s, women wore miniskirts. They were cool with being part of the Western world. And if, Jimmy Carter wasn't paying attention, there was a lot of just like asleep at the wheel bullshit that could have been addressed that would have, so another what if of history. I've got a show pitch. I haven't pitched anything to try to get it made in a long time, but I still think of shows. I've got one called Old Jesus, where Jesus's friends, maybe along with, decide to pull him off the cross, and then replace him with they find another dead guy and they put him up there. And the Romans think, all right, well, that's it for Jesus. So they pull him down, which is against God's wishes, right? And so Jesus is pretty much immortal, but God's pissed at him. So he just has to live on earth for the next 2,000 years and just have adventures. And he's a good guy because he's Jesus. So we meet Jesus, 2,000 years later, where he's kind of, he doesn't age at a normal rate because he's Jesus. So it's, somebody like Sam Elliott, but maybe a little younger. just this guy with long grayish Jesus-y hair, who's the chillest guy in the world because he's seen everything for the past 2,000 years. And, he's like the equalizer. He's got some powers and he's pretty sharp, again, from all his, and for good. And, he just hangs out. He has adventures, and
I could see it going into season 2 easily.
okay.
However, I don't want to be too U.S. oriented in this, because, like if we think about what would happen in Asia, including India or Africa, what would be some of the world-changing events that have happened in those places that if we could go back in time, we would change? I think, like, for example, in India, Gandhi was a positive force, but British, took over it there, and also they, carved out Israel and other things. So maybe what was the most influential? Like, could we have done something about Mao Zedong, for example?
Yeah, because Mao Zedong, when people talk about killers, it's always Hitler, who was responsible for the deaths of at least 30 million people. But Stalin, 40 or 50 million.
More, right.
And then Mao, 50, 60 million of his own people. Is there a time in history, like I think Mao takes over China in what, 1948?
Well, I would have to check, right?
Because somewhere around there, sometime after World War II. Right. And maybe there's a time where if you're going to time travel, you show up and you put a bomb in Mao's neck and you say no culture, because it's the Cultural Revolution is what, 1968 maybe?
Yeah.
All right, so you say, look, you don't kill all your frickin' people, and we won't set off this bomb in your neck. Same with Stalin. Stalin killed so many of his own people, and there may have been times when you could intervene, and and also money diplomacy. Like, was there ever a time when the U.S., which owned the world after World War II, could have talked to Stalin and said, look, don't be a dick, don't repress your people, don't this Iron Curtain bullshit, and we'll make it worth your while. We will finance some of your shit. I don't think it would have worked, because I think the political gap was too great, but I don't know.
Yeah, and also, you think about the Russian Revolution, which was in 1917, and it toppled the czars and the nobles and that, and they had a serf economy, and then Lenin was in power, and then Stalin. Yeah. And somewhere in there's a great book called The Master and the Margarita, that talks about the repression of the arts and under Stalin, and so he has all these people that are turned into monsters in the story, but they represent people in the then Soviet government, repressing and preventing the creativity. So is there a way of influencing that in a way that the idea of communism, which is really a treating everyone equally, rather than the authoritarian outcome that we've seen in both China and Russia, where communism is just a word that describes a ruler, a despot, like a czar, much like a czar. And so, is there a way that we could gently influence it rather than have a bomb in some individual's neck? We can gently.
And also, there are some larger trends that don't hinge on just individual political decisions. But if you could show up in the early days of cars and talk to people about, the potential for climate change, and say, think about, when I was a kid, I remember gas in the 60s being as cheap as like a dime a gallon.
it was not even a factor in your
Yeah. So
budget.
if you could talk to people like, a Packard in 1930 something, probably weighed 6,000 pounds and probably got 7 miles a gallon. And if you could talk to, the manufacturers saying, hey, maybe you want to make lighter, more efficient cars because this, by doing what you're doing, you're fucking the future. Um, and but on the other hand, this can backfire. My wife and I watch a show called The Gilded Age.
Oh yeah. I saw season 1, I think.
All right, so it's about a rich guy, I guess, who's a stand-in for Cornelius Vanderbilt. My
Right.
wife tells me,
The
a
old
great
money versus the new.
industrialist.
Yeah.
So, like, I think about going back in time and pitching that guy some stuff because
Yeah.
but the deal is, if you pitched him, if you showed up with an iPad that had the history of the future on it, yeah, you and he could make a ton of money and maybe even, come up with some stuff that would be helpful. On the other hand, the idea of the atomic bomb could get out 40, 50 years before it did. And a world in which the atomic bomb is possible during World War I, that's a
Wow.
terrifying freaking world.
Yes.
Because those guys were big idiots, like people are, and they would have used it.
Right. It's fascinating. They certainly would have. And but the other idea about just not lighter cars, but we decided not to invest in mass transportation, but into cars. And this was part of the American idea of individuality. And also there were companies that had a big investment, like Goodyear, for example, wanted the rubber in the tires. And so there was a lot of corporate interest in cars, and a lot of people could make a lot of money. And the idea of mass transit, trains everywhere, and the ease of use, and focusing on that would have revolutionized our country, but it wasn't in the financial interest of these corporations to do so. So I don't see how you would change.
Well, I think you talked to Eisenhower, who was a pretty he was, in retrospect, a pretty decent president.
I
And he
agree.
understood logistics, but he is the one who gave us our interstate highway system.
And
And he
also
called it, and
talked about the military industrial complex.
right, but he said we're going to build a bunch of highways crisscrossing the country, east, west, and north, south, and that way, if we're ever invaded, we can move our forces faster to stop the invasion. But really, it was to get America on the roads. So you go to Eisenhower in your time machine and you say, well, this is great. America has been a great country with, one car for every adult. On the other hand, it's fucking us in the future. So along with this interstate highway system, we might need some other stuff, like looking at mass transit, like our train system, lags the rest of the world. But also it's tough because the rest of the world are these little countries that are more compact.
Right.
The Western US is a crazy, if you're trying to do mass transit, it's tough because of the distances. But you talk to Eisenhower, say, or do the highways, but also start thinking about making cars less efficient. More efficient, so they burn less gas, because you're not going to have gas forever.
Right.
And he would, so
well,
maybe your levers throughout history are finding the people who aren't assholes and empowering them.
Yeah. And another thing was like, what if Kennedy wasn't shot? Well, what if President McKinley wasn't shot? And there's all sorts of things that we could change if we had our way. And the outcomes would be unpredictable.
Or you go back to the Constitutional Convention and you say, hi, you're in a silver suit. Everybody's freaking out. You need to go wear a silver suit for time travel for some reason. You say, sorry to bug you guys. I'm from the future. You've probably got some kind of laser blaster and say, don't freaking run away. And you shoot it a couple times into the ceiling in Philadelphia and say, just give me a second. And you say, look, the language of the Second Amendment needs to be clarified a little bit. It's causing great, turmoil 200 years from now. Don't get rid of it, but explain what you mean by a well-regulated militia, and also think about, your guns are shitty. They're muskets. Even the fastest reloader it takes 45 seconds to, do the
yeah.
So, but in the future, we're going to have guns that fire, can fire 3-4 rounds a second, and you put in some language that says, yeah, those guns maybe shouldn't go to every frickin' Yahoo.
Right. Yeah. Now you're talking. And in history, how far back would you go, do you think, before it gets too weird in terms of predicting the future and the consequences?
I don't think of it in terms of weird. I think of it in terms of boring. Like if you go back and you save Jesus, or something else happens. So Chris, I've read short stories set in a world in which Christianity doesn't take hold and the Roman Empire doesn't fall. And that's a boring ass story to me, because I don't give a crap much about the Roman Empire. I don't want to see it translated into modern terms. It's not interesting to me. What's interesting is to go back into history and pluck people I'm familiar with and hook them up. You resurrect Abraham Lincoln, and you have him dating resurrected Jane Austen. I want to see that. I want to,
yeah,
that's fun. And we are going to get all that thanks to AI. AI will let us build all these alternate worlds with, various degrees of veracity. But, AI, before it kills us, will give us a ton of fun.
That is a very encouraging thought. And I also think that, when we talk about these things, and and you alluded to this earlier, like, would you go back to teach science to somebody, to an Albert Einstein, or to a physicist prior to that, to Niels Bohr, and you tell them what it is as far as our understanding is today, and what would be the effect? And one of the effects might be the development of a nuclear weapon way before, not that we were capable of using them wisely in our present day or in World War II, but if we accelerated that by a half century, what would have been the
consequence? So here's how it played out. So in the 30s, Leo Szilard, Hitler, kind of got kicked out. All the scientists left. All the Jewish or ethnic scientists left Germany because Hitler made it too scary.
Right. And they're leaving America now too.
Yeah. So Leo Szilard, of, I don't know, maybe Hungarian or whatever, realizes that it's bad that an atomic bomb is possible, and it's bad if Germany gets it first. And he goes to Einstein, because nobody's going to talk to Szilard, and gets Einstein to write a letter to FDR explaining the potential. And FDR creates the Manhattan Project to develop the bomb. Now, if you could go back in time and talk to Szilard and Einstein and explain what we think happened with the atomic bomb in Germany, that they didn't have the resources, that maybe some of the remaining scientists kind of dragged their feet on it because they didn't want Hitler to have the atomic bomb either, that they never came close to having an atomic bomb. So you might see Einstein, instead of saying we need to build the bomb, or he might have said, yeah, we need a bomb, but we should also freaking send a shitload of spies into Germany and surrounding countries to see where their project stands. Because if Germany isn't at all close to having the atomic bomb, maybe we don't want to create this horrible weapon. If FDR would probably have said, no, screw it. We're going to develop this horrible weapon. And I want us to have it. But I don't know. I don't frickin' know.
Yeah, but I think that we actually used it against Japan.
Yeah, which is another question of history. If we'd had the atomic bomb a year earlier, would we have dropped it on like just before the D-Day? I imagine they could have dropped one or two of them on the Normandy coast to clean out the whole coast of knock out the bunkers. And yeah, all the Allied forces invading would have gotten a little dose of radiation, but it's better to get some radiation than to get machine gunned in half.
Well, we're not saying you wouldn't get your hair a little mussed.
Yeah, no, you probably, yeah. But would we have, if we had the atomic bomb in November of 44, would we have dropped it on white Europeans? I think so, but I don't know.
Yeah. And it seems to me like if you dropped it on an atoll out where uninhabited and demonstrated the power of it, how convincing would that have been to someone like Hitler?
I hear arguments about that, and usually the counter argument is, you don't understand. The Japanese were fanatical. They needed to be shocked deeply but just a demonstration wouldn't have budged them. And there's also the question, it's like, okay, yeah, but we just blew up a whole city with one bomb and killed 120,000 people in a second. Wouldn't that have been enough? And then, or maybe, you destroy Hiroshima, and then you drop another one on an atoll saying, look, we have a ton of these. We didn't, but we probably had enough. I think we may have had 3 of them, and enough, the tech was in place that we could have made a new one every month. They had to be convinced that the A bombs weren't going to stop falling. So, but I don't know, because
actually, that's a good point. Last year I went to Japan and I saw the Holocaust Museum in Hiroshima, and it was like, it was mind-numbingly depressing. And I don't know if people, and certainly myself growing up, did not have an appreciation for how horrific it was.
Also, you had an amateur in charge of the U.S. because FDR gets elected for the 4th time. He's now in his 13th year as president. He's been in charge of the Manhattan Project for the whole time. He croaks, and then they install Truman, and he's president for like 3-4 months, and they tell him, we have this horrific weapon, and do you want to use it? And he's like, heck yeah. Now, would a president who's been aware of this for 6 years have reached the same conclusion? There's a scene in Oppenheimer, the movie, where Oppenheimer goes in to Truman and acts all sad about what he's been responsible for creating, and Truman's like, okay, pal, and then after he leaves, Truman says to an assistant, yeah, I never want to talk to that pussy again.
Yeah. There's also an element that I think might say, that we think that some of us think that the Japanese were fanatics and they needed to be shocked and blah, blah. And there may be a racist.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. Would we have dropped an atomic bomb on Berchtesgaden, Hitler's vacation home?
Yeah. Or that the Japanese wouldn't have been able to realize that without the horrific evidence that this was going to happen, and they needed to sue for peace.
I'm in favor of if we had a time machine, I'm in favor of taking a couple atomic bombs back to December 1941 and just dropping one on the Japanese fleet. I think that would have shut down the war on the Japan side pretty freaking quick.
Yeah,
But
okay.
and also, we're not going to be able to do anything like that, except we are, because as AI gets better and better, we're going to be able to game all this. I mean, in fact, I'm sure people are already gamifying this.
Oh, yeah.
There are probably World War II games where you can mess around with this stuff.
Right. Right. And again, the veracity is in question, but some better than others.
But that leads to another question, where we've been talking about stuff we can't do. But should we examine the present moment as if, if we could have time travelers from the future, what would they tell us to do in the present moment?
That's an excellent question. What if the silver suit guy showed up, and what would he say?
I mean, I know about trends. I know that I follow a writer named Cory Doctorow, who says it's obvious that when government fails its people, people will get what they want through extra governmental organization, and technology makes it possible to, he calls it forming tribes, maybe, where you can, team up with people better than ever before. And so far it's been to our detriment, because the internet has made it possible for racist a-holes to get together. But you can also get people together for good. And, if the government isn't going to, so I assume a person from the future would say, get off your asses and figure out effective means of, now that doesn't mean revolution. The US is badly set up for internal revolution. Plus, you wouldn't want it. We tried it with the Civil War, and it was bad. But geographically, it's not feasible. Which is, I mean, it's really hard to shut down the country through a general strike. England gets shut down, France gets shut down. The culinary workers go on strike. So the transit workers and everybody else, they all go on strike in France, and France shuts down for a week until the strikers, negotiate a deal. You can't do that with the U.S. The U.S. is too big, too diverse. So I don't know what forms of action. We have huge turnouts for protests. After Trump got elected the first time, 1 million people turn out in pussy hats, pink hats. Did that do it? It didn't do beans. So I don't know. Maybe the silver guy from the future would be able to tell us what finally worked, what helped break the stranglehold of propaganda on 30, 40 million Americans.
It would have been, I think, the revenge of the nerds, the geeks who control AI, will be able to control the sources of your information.
Well, that's what I'm afraid of. I think it's fairly inevitable that AI will end up mostly in charge of stuff. An open question is how soon before that happens, and who is allied with AI to be in charge with stuff.
Right.
So AI is going to be smart as shit, and will be able to think faster than we do. So to keep up, we will have to modify and augment ourselves. And it's scary if it's the tech bros who are in league with AI, because a lot of those guys are greedy idiots.
Yes, but we, for example, the French Revolution. Many of us have this idea of Marie Antoinette. Then, when told that the people they don't have bread, she would say, "Well, let them eat cake," because she was so divorced and detached.
Yeah,
And this is true here. But, when you're talking about a revolution, you're not talking about the tech bros. You're talking about the guys in their mother's basement.
Yeah,
Um,
so the French, a lot of the French revolutionaries like Robespierre were bloodthirsty a-holes. And
absolutely.
if they didn't start off that way, they turned that way when they got a taste of power.
Right.
So they were cutting off heads left and right. Um, People who maybe were desperate to show that they were able to reform. Nope, off with your heads. And
Yeah.
I
So
mean,
the revolution that I see in the future would be, for example, you say we're too diverse to shut down. Well, can you shut down the energy system in the United States? And can a coordinated effort do that?
and is that what we want?
No, that's not what we want, but is that what we're going to get? Because people are so disaffected and feel so alienated from their governing bodies, from the authority figures. And this goes to the people that are running Google and Meta, and as well as the federal government. What we have is enormous income inequality right now, where people can't get started, they can't buy a house, they can't live the American dream the way they used to, and they're frustrated, but they're technologically savvy, and they're getting to know this world, this technological world, this world of AI, in ways that I cannot possibly appreciate, cannot possibly understand. And so they're growing up as a generation disaffected, disinterested in the preservation of things as they are, and they want to tear it down. It's a nihilistic idea, but it's tear down rather than build up. And if that sentiment, if they get in touch with each other, and they don't do it in a way that the military is tracking. So they're doing this in an underground way of connecting, and there's a web that's forming and growing across the country. And if they all push enter at the same time, the
Yeah,
the
I
results
mean
could be
that's
backwards.
dystopia is when you're making a movie about the future. Post-apocalyptic dystopia is pretty much the cheapest way to go, both in making sets and in imagination. It's hard to imagine, a functioning or semi-functioning future. It's easy to imagine a future in which everything's been wiped out and we're back to riding horses, and you go out to the desert on the way to Vegas and you throw up a few junky sets, or you go to, there's a place called Zizek's Road. Everybody sees the sign on the way to Vegas, and there's a ruined spa. Like you take the turn, and there are ruins, and you shoot your apocalypse there. You put some people in leather long coats, and you do your dumb apocalypse movie there. But to imagine a future that, and when you do imagine like an interesting future, it becomes a cliche, like Blade Runner. Blade Runner has this rainy, kind of grimy, filled with neon and whores future that is semi-functional, mostly dystopian, but it looks really good. The Blade Runner movies look better than they are. And so that look becomes the cliche look for,
I see what you're saying.
of science fiction movies. But if you can imagine like a new future, which is not easy, people will glom onto it. And also, we can do anything now. My wife and I saw the new Fantastic Four movie. You know that there's never been a Fantastic Four movie that hasn't sucked ass, right?
Right, right.
Until now. And this new one pretty much doesn't suck ass, and it's set in an alternate 1965 that has more tech than our 1965 did, and they built all of Manhattan in this retro futuristic style, and it looks freaking great. And that's so crazy because the movie cost 200 million, but to make it with the tech we have now, it would have been A, impossible, and B, cost $1 billion. So we can imagine different futures. You don't
Sure.
have to go to Zizek's Road. And
Well, Isaac Asimov did. And isn't Foundation playing on some one of the streaming
yeah,
networks?
but freaking Asimov wasn't so imaginative. Isaac Asimov wrote as fast as he typed. He would
Yes.
write his books at 90 words a minute and no revisions. It was up to, if he made a typo, some editor might catch it later. He wrote 400, 500 books. And, it would take, a book is 90,000 words at 90 a minute. So he could write a book in 16 hours. And boom, done. And which means there's not much room for considered imagination, for world building. So you got a superficially constructed world. If you want to imagine the future, maybe you assemble a writer's room of the best sci-fi authors writing about the near future. Neil Stephenson, Charles Strauss, David Marusek, Ramez Nan. I'm sure I'm leaving women off the list, but people who've already thought about the near future, and then you put them all together, maybe with some experts, and they start building a frickin'. Has anybody done that yet? Not so much.
Right.
Usually you bring in a bunch of people who are great at writing, and then you bring in one or two consultants, and
right.
they try to have you stick a little bit to reality.
But a real conglomerate of creative people, sometimes that clicks and sometimes that doesn't. Sometimes they just end up arguing with each other. And
right. I've got a tic-tac-toe theory of production, that three people in key positions who are smart give you a really good chance of a decent production. They can gloss over any incompetence in other people. Maybe if the network people are okay, or the streaming people, I guess now. But also three schmucks in key positions can guarantee a piece of shit show.
Doesn't matter how creative you are if you give it to a schmuck to produce. But the idea of the creativity is another subject entirely. But the idea of taking history and changing it, or taking an alternate future and creating it, what's the connection there? Because I think there is a connection between trying to change the past to create an alternate reality today, or changing today to create an alternate reality.
All right, so, when Einstein talked about God a little bit, and other physicists talk about the poetry of science, when they talk like this, it's when they talk about beauty in theoretical science, they're talking about how things that apply to the universe just make a kind of sense because of their transcendent clarity and simplicity.
Exactly. This is when Einstein talked about God, he talked about, yes, I believe in Schrodinger's God, and it was about the simplicity. EMC squared is considered a elegant equation because it's simple.
So and you can compare it to the Martin Luther King Jr. quote that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. So,
which is
so if you're thinking about how to re-engineer the past, re-engineer the present, re-engineer the future, it doesn't hurt to think poetically a little bit about so as AI gets all up in our shit, we're gonna, our bodies are gonna change because we're gonna have to keep up, and then so we have to decide what is of value about us Is it the shape of our bodies? Is it that we get old and die? I don't think that's it. We have to figure out what is essentially human, and by human I mean what is beautiful about us, what is of moral value about us, and we live in an orderly universe.
Yes.
Um, and I'm not talking about like authoritarian order where you better not get
Right.
chewing gum on the side. I'm talking about a world that people want to live in.
But there are
Because,
laws of thermodynamics.
right, but that you're shielded somewhat from chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that mean as we move into the future? How do we shield ourselves from chaos and preserve what matters and figure out what really matters as everything is shifting underfoot?
Well, I thought for a long time that the future people are going to look back at our past and see that the time when we stopped being Homo sapiens, we became Homo something else.
Right.
And
And future people are going to be bored by our bullshit because it's going to seem so simple. Like
primitive.
primitive, right? Our fascination with primates, non-human primates, is pretty freaking limited. We don't really care what monkeys get up to, right? We think it's hilarious that they throw poop, and we think it's interesting that bonobos are supposed to be like super horny and they do all sorts of like crazy sex fun. But we quickly grow bored with lower animals. We love it with it. A parrot has a 300 word vocabulary and can use words in sentences, which is great. We love that. But are we going to watch that parrot for more than half an hour? Nah. Future beings will look at our output and be like, yeah, that's just like that. That's them throwing poo. Um, so we have to, I don't know, try to rise to the moment and embrace what isn't corrosive about the tech that's coming.
And you're also putting your finger on what was so disappointing for me is that I thought in the last presidential election in the United States that our better angels would speak to us and we would not reelect Donald Trump. Yet we did. And it's having a funny effect, and he's very divisive in the United States, but he seems to be uniting the rest of the world against us. So
Yeah, no, so Donna, given that the population is 8 billion on Earth, and the population when Hitler was alive was, I don't know, 2 billion.
mm-hmm.
So given that
Something.
we've got a bunch more people, Trump might be the living person disliked by the most people ever. Now, there are a couple other candidates. Netanyahu isn't well liked, Putin isn't well liked, but one of those guys is probably disliked by more people than have ever disliked a living person before.
That's a lot of negative energy.
Yeah. I mean, they do surveys, and Trump's approval across the world, not just in America, ranges from Trump's, he's got, 20% approval in some countries up to, some like Hungary, which is kind of a fascist country. You
Right.
might have 50% approval, but he's mostly underwater. Not that he gives a shit. He doesn't have to have approval. He doesn't even have to have approval in the US because he has the levers of government.
But he does respond to approval, which he surrounds himself with people who tell him how great he is.
Yeah, but that's all he needs.
Yes. Yeah. But in carving out a future scenario, what you're putting your finger on is that what is the best of humanity, and it turns out, I think, that the creative aspect of the human condition, because I say that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and the more we tap into that, the better our behavior is, the better our output is, the higher our consciousness is. And if we can do that, if we can sustain a more spiritual nature, it produces great effect. And not in terms of building weapons of mass destruction, perhaps, but in building communities where we have a global economy. We are so short of having a global community.
So
But if that became our focus, if that you're human, you're not Hungarian, you're not Russian, you're not United Statesian.
yeah, so there's a movement I know zero about except for the name called the abundance movement, I think.
Okay.
I don't know anything about it, but I like the name in that um, I kind of I filled in the blanks and I've decided it probably means somebody saying that if we're not assholes about stuff, there's enough for everybody.
Yes, that's
And I'm writing this novel set in the near future, and the main character is kind of an AI whisperer. And that character decides that the way to stop AI from wrecking too much stuff is to try to persuade it that there are enough resources for everybody, every AI, and also people, and nobody needs to go to war. And the AI whisperer is trying to set up something he calls the long peace, that he's arguing that we're not going to have a resource shortage, that we can work steadily and create the resources we need, because the earth captures, what AI is going to need is compute, the ability to do a lot of computation and the energy to do it with. And this
precisely.
whisperer says you'll have enough energy if you just follow a program of developing energy, that the earth only absorbs, less than 1/millionth of the light from the sun. And we just need to work to capture more and more light from the sun for our computation needs. We build stuff in space. We pave the moon and solar panels. We dismantle asteroids and we build shit. And
We figure out fusion.
that this program of increasing resources should serve us well for a couple thousand years. And 2,000 years from now, then we can worry about limited resources. But until then, let's work together, and not destroy each other unnecessarily. And also to save humanity, he's trying to convince AI that it costs so little to keep humans. The cost of keeping a hamster, I don't know, or a goldfish is not much.
Right.
So, and humans would, to AI, maybe humans are like hamsters, and we're like, and the whisperer is like, just freaking let the little hamsters have their hamster wheels. You don't need to obliterate them.
That is also the second most encouraging thing that you've said today, because I can see that that's not just a possibility, that is a likelihood that AI can be given that thought of abundance. Oh, and I'm going to go really low intelligence here in a way. And did you watch the latest Mad Max movie by any chance?
Parts of it.
Is Charlize Theron in it? Because that's
No, I think they have, it's a prequel with some other actor being the same character as a younger woman, and she starts off having both arms.
okay. So, all right. So I guess I watched the one with Theron in it, and she there was the people were talking about there was a land of abundance that she came from. She remembers, but there was that's what everybody wants, to get to this land of abundance. And if we could program that into, it's a core essential, like Asimov would have the robotics.
The 3 laws of robotics.
Yes, thank you. And so the AI would have that at its core, and to have abundance, because it is possible. And it's only when we want things in excess for purposes that do not really serve, that do not serve this idea of abundance. And they then we can deplete these resources, and our history shows it again and again. We think that resources are infinite when they're finite. We talked about land that way. We talked about the oceans that way. We're talking about rivers. We used to think were abundant. We can pour toxic chemicals into them. And when one of them caught fire because of what we were doing to them, it shocked people into taking precautions.
Yeah, Cleveland, the river running through Cleveland caught fire in the 70s.
Right. And that, turned out to have the dreaded R word, which was regulations to prevent it, which, again, people were not getting sick, animals and foliage and fauna, but fauna and foliage were not being killed, including people. So these types of things, which are, just humane ways of looking at the world, don't poison it. And we thinking about that now. We're starting to think about that in terms of our
with AI. It's called the alignment problem, where how do you train AI so its goals and priorities line up with human priorities? And you could turn it around and say, how do you align schmucks with the rest of humanity so their priorities, that frickin', I mean, we've got a president in place and RFK in place, and at least half the time they seem to be they're unaligned with what Americans want.
Right. Rick, I'm sorry, but we've gone over time.
Yeah, we've been talking forever.
And you continue to fascinate me, which makes me lose track of time. So I'm going to take you backstage to goodbye to our viewing audience, and I will hopefully see you next week.
All right. And thanks for watching, everybody.
I will have attended my 50th high school reunion. So don't let me forget to talk about that.
Yeah, I'm at like 47, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Well.
All right. Well, have fun. That's awesome. All right.
And the stories we're going to tell are more going to be about the past than the future. But I'll see you.
So you're not going to try to hook up with the cutest girl in 12th grade?
But she already told me that she's not going.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you. That was Rick Rosner, Emmy-nominated writer, one of the highest IQs in the country, and I got the chance to talk to him, and I do each week. But write to us at info@airu.tv. Pose a question, and the two of us will put our heads together, and who knows what's going to come out of our heads. But I don't want to stay in my head too long. I know that's not good for me. So thank you for watching the show. Thank you for helping others, being sensitive to others and their needs, and not judging them if they have hard times, because hard times are when we all experience them. And the more people that give you a hand out when you need it, the better all of us will be.